they have a lot of countries in the European Parliament. In order to sanction someone or sanction an entity or an individual, you need to have all countries to approve and say yes to that sanctions program. And that is really hard, because even if one country like Hungary said no because they are worried about their relationship with Russia, that would cause delay on any sanctions program. And for the United States, I'm not saying that they are perfect, but so far they have been enforcing most sanctions in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they have even better system that they have the ability to sanction companies that are not in the US.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today we've got a bit of a special because we're chatting to Chloe Cheung. Now Chloe is a young Hong Kong-born pro-democracy activist who's become a potent symbol of transnational repression. As a teenager, she joined the 2019 Hong Kong protest movement before leaving for the UK around 2020, and now holds the role of Public Affairs and Advocacy Junior Manager at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. Now, Chloe, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Now, we're doing this because you produced a report into Parliament yesterday that was titled Bypassing the Blockade: How Hong Kong Feeds European Technology into Russia's War in Ukraine. And it goes a little bit more than just European technology. But I've read the report. It's shocking. But for the listeners out there, can you give us an understanding of the conclusions that it came up with?
Yeah. Basically, our report is quite simple. Summing up in one sentence is that British manufacturer components are appearing in Russian weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine via Hong Kong. So that's the conclusion of the report. We have been looking at Ukraine battlefield database. We have been looking at Russian's custom record. We have been looking at Hong Kong company registry, and we found out that these components that are manufactured in Europe, in Britain, or manufacturers from Europe and Britain are, selling their products to Hong Kong, and these products, these weapon components, are re-exported to Russia.
So how is it that you know that the components are not being used for innocent purposes in Hong Kong, as I'm sure that was what was on the excuse to export them certificate, if it's called the excuse to export certificate?
Yeah, so we have been tracing the supply chain. We saw pictures from the Ukraine database, like Ukraine battlefield database, and we saw there are these Western components on military weapons, and they have logo on these weapons component, and these are British company's logo, European company logo, and we tried to trace where these components are from, and we saw on the Russian custom record that there are lots and lots of these components are shipped from Hong Kong to Russia. And we also find out that because there are something called a CHPL list, a common high priority list that are from the United Kingdom and its allies, that are they identify a list of items that are critical for the war in Ukraine, which are critical for Russia to create their weapons. And these components are not supposed to go into Russia. However, these components are still going to Russia. The only way they can do that is not by exporting directly to Russia, but via a third country, which is Hong Kong.
And these Hong Kong companies that are importing them, are they doing it deliberately to get the components to send them straight to Russia? Or are they using other similar components themselves for their own business?
Well, as the company that we analyzed in this report are mainly shipping them for Russia's purpose only. And there are shell companies, there are companies that only got a website, there are some companies that are not even registered on the Hong Kong company registry, but we saw all these names on the custom record from Russia.
Interesting. So what was the reception with the report you put in Parliament? And have you had any comeback from the companies that you've identified whose components are being supplied?
Well, I knew that there are journalists who are trying to ask these company whether they knew that is happening or not. But there are, I think, one of the British company, XP Power, has denied it. They said they have never traded with these Hong Kong company, but we have seen that these Hong Kong company are shipping XP Power's components into Russia. That is written on the custom record, and it's hard to deny that because that is a fact. And from our point of view, we think that there are a couple of things that the UK government can do, and there are a couple of things that the companies can do, including increasing their due diligence on to check whether these components are shipped to a Hong Kong company that are actually using, like as you mentioned, the products themselves, or whether they are trying to re-export it to Russia, because most of these trades, they use shell companies from Hong Kong. And we also found that throughout the network of companies from Hong Kong, they have the same beneficial owner behind these company. And which means that the same group of people are doing the same thing with different shell company. And if you are like XP Power, or if you are any British manufacturer, when you sell it to a Hong Kong company, you should ask them whether they have electricity bill to prove that they're not a shell company, they're actually working. They should ask them for their proof of operation, proof of their business that they're doing, to make sure that they're actually using this product not for war, not for re-exporting to Russia, not for killing Ukrainians, but for their own business. So I think there are lots of things that businesses can do, government can do to actually stop that.
But a lot of these components, they have to be therefore classed as dual-use components, and therefore they're subject to sanctions. Countries around the world have got different sanctions regimes. The United States has got a separate one to the UK, it's got a separate one to the EU. Which is working best, and why is it not working?
Well, for me, I think if you compared all the sanctions system around the world, I would say that the one from the United States are doing the best. It's hard to talk about every single sanction system like right now, but I would say that it's not just about the system. It's also about the enforcement of the system. Because in the UK and in EU, I think the sanctions system and the sanctions guideline is actually not bad. But the problem is that there is a lack of enforcement. In the UK, there are less than 1% of suspected sanctions case that are actually getting fined. So there are a problem with investigation, with enforcement in the UK, and for EU, they have a lot of countries in the European Parliament. In order to sanction someone or sanction an entity or an individual, you need to have all countries to approve and say yes to that sanctions program. And that is really hard, because even if one country like Hungary said no because they are worried about their relationship with Russia, that would cause delay on any sanctions program. And for the United States, I'm not saying that they are perfect, but so far they have been enforcing most sanctions in the world, and they have even better system that they have the ability to sanctions company that are not in the US. So that if a company set up a subsidiary in let's say Vietnam, the United States can also sanction that company and say no US citizen could ever trade with them anymore. So that's the good thing about US sanctions.
And what's China's reaction been to this, or have they not been made aware of it? Are they, what do you think they will do?
So in our report, why did we pick Hong Kong? One of the reasons is because the Hong Kong chief executive specifically said that we will not comply with US sanctions. We will not comply with Western sanctions. And therefore, it opens the door for sanctions evader to go to Hong Kong and do all these trade transshipments to Russia. And for China, I think they are the same as well. They don't really care about what other people say, what other countries, said, what other countries sanctions guideline are. They are just going to do whatever they want because they are friends with Russia and other countries. When sanctions Chinese, they will sanction Chinese company, but they can easily shut it down and open another one, because the gap in current sanctions system for UK Europe or even United States is that they always only sanction the entity, which means that in our report we discovered and like a Hong Kong, like a Chinese person who one of his company was sanctioned by European, by EU, by US, and by Switzerland, and he just dissolved the company and he opened up another company and continued the trade again. So for me, I think it's kind of pointless if you only sanction the entity. I think they have to sanction the beneficial owner behind it in order to actually stop the transshipment from going.
Well, Chloe Cheung, you're bypassing the blockade. Hong Kong, how Hong Kong feeds European technology into Russia's war in Ukraine. A fascinating report, which I recommend to everyone to read. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me today on Frontline.
Thank you.